In this video and in the next one, we're going to talk about some of the policies that states and other actors try to use to mitigate the security dilemma. And that really is how to think about these things. As we know, there's a security dilemma. Some schools of thought put more emphasis on it than others. But if we understand that there are these dynamics, what can we do to limit them? And so arms control, just to define it, is a formal agreement to refrain from building or deploying certain kinds of weapons. And oftentimes, arms control agreements have not only agreements about weapons, but agreements about verification so that both sides know, or multiple sides know, that others are doing what they've said they're going to do. Or they can at least be warned if they stop doing it. So how does it work? Well, first, you got to recognize that there's some kind of arms race or arms competition, right? This recognition that there's a tit-for-tat dynamic, so that it's not just that states are trying to build their own security, but that they're responding to what others are doing. And you sort of, in order to think that arms control is a good idea, you have to have this sense that there's a dynamic that's counterproductive, a security dilemma. And then you negotiate a deal. And sometimes it takes years to negotiate these deals, and sometimes it takes years and you never get around to it. You never quite agree. But essentially it's, you don't build this and we won't build that. And then, as I said, you often say, and here's how we'll reassure one another that neither of us is cheating. That's basically arms control. There are some important obstacles to arms control. One is, of course, there's always disagreement about who should be allowed to have what weapons and how much. So we've been negotiating with Iran about nuclear weapons. Should Iran have nuclear weapons? Well, the Iranians think they ought to be able to have them because the U.S. does and a bunch of other countries do. We say not such a hot idea. Intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, should Iran have those or not? So there's just disagreements about who should have what. And of course, there's always this fear that if you reach an agreement, that you're going to end up with an agreement that will leave the other side with an advantage, or that you will lose an advantage, or that if you agree to freeze things where they are now, that you're at some disadvantage now, that will be made permanent by an arms control agreement, and you'd rather keep building so that you can eliminate that disadvantage and then maybe talk about arms control once your advantage has been eliminated. So there's any number of reasons why states find it hard to come to agreement. And of course, there's fears that you'll limit what you're doing and that while the other side cheats. And that's been a huge one involved in some of the discussions with North Korea, and Iran. Despite all those difficulties, there are some really important arms control agreements over the decades. And I point to the SALT I agreement in 1972. SALT stands for Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, and there was a SALT II agreement later. We don't need to get into all the details. But the reason this one is so important is that these were global geopolitical rivals. They were ideologic rivals, right? It was communism versus capitalism and democracy. And yet still these two countries found it in their interest to come up with some kind of agreement. Why? Well, because they had been building nuclear weapons and missiles to put them on. And it just seemed like it was getting incredibly expensive. It was increasing the level of hostility. And at some point, it seemed like you weren't getting that much security out of it, but it was increasing the danger and the expense. And so they simply said, we're going to freeze the number of missiles at the existing levels. And that was really interesting because the Soviet Union had about 50% more than the United States did at the time. The numbers are there. And so the U.S. actually agreed to freezing what was a disparity. Now, the U.S. wasn't too worried about that because the U.S. was introducing this technology of putting multiple warheads on a single missile, and so they thought they'd be able to make up the difference. But more importantly, there was just a sense that once you've launched 1,000 nuclear weapons, right, another 500 doesn't make much difference, right? It's the end of the world as we know it. But that agreement worked out, and in terms of some of its successor agreements, essentially that agreement is still in force. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was reached in 1968, and it is still in force. And this one's more interesting because instead of involving two countries, it basically involves almost all of the countries of the world. And it's interesting because it put in place a clear distinction between haves and have-nots. Right? The 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, which were the 5 countries that already clearly had nuclear weapons, China, France, the Soviet Union, or now Russia, the UK, and the US, the treaty said they're allowed to keep their weapons, although they have to pledge that they're going to try to reduce the numbers. And all of the other countries who signed on, which was almost all the other countries in the world, said, and we won't build nuclear weapons. Now, in return, the deal was that the 5 nuclear powers have to share non-military nuclear technology, which especially was important for energy generation and medicine, and that there would be verification measures so that if I was a country, just say Germany, for example, and I've agreed that I'm not going to get nuclear weapons, even though I easily could, I've got to be assured that everybody else is doing what they say they're going to do. And so this includes very far-reaching and strict monitoring proposals so that at every nuclear power plant in the world that's in a non-nuclear weapons state, there are monitors from the International Atomic Energy Agency that are paying very close attention to make sure that nuclear material is not being diverted from peaceful nuclear energy programs into weapons programs. Now, so this is all awesome. The downside is the countries that decided not to sign it are the ones who actually have had their own nuclear weapons programs. So India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea are all nuclear weapons states now, although Israel doesn't claim so publicly. It is. So there's a question as to whether it really deterred anybody that wasn't already set on doing it. I would argue that it has. Japan, I think, is a great example. Given what North Korea is doing, given China next door, it would be easy for Japan to build nuclear weapons. But as long as it's been reassured to some extent about what others were doing, it's resisted. Bringing this up to date then, let's talk about a current nuclear arms control problem, which is the question of Iran. So in 2015, a bunch of countries signed this thing called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the Iran nuclear deal. And Iran did not agree to completely get rid of its nuclear weapons program, but it agreed to limitations in how much uranium it was going to enrich. In other words, limitations in how quickly and how it could produce nuclear weapons material and how fast and how much. And it agreed to some very specific verification measures. And the agreement was for 15 years. The U.S., the European Union, and the United Nations agreed that if Iran did this, that these actors would terminate all the sanctions they had put in place against Iran. So Iran got reduced sanctions and still at least some ability to continue work on a nuclear weapons program, while the others felt like the progress on Iran's nuclear weapons program was going to be dramatically slowed down. That would give more time for negotiations to maybe get Iran to give up entirely. And another big benefit was that the international community, which had a very difficult time agreeing with each other about what to do about Iran, could all agree to this. Now, in 2018, the United States government withdrew from the agreement. Iran, for a little while, said, we'll abide by it, but then in 2019 said, now, if the Americans are out, we're out. And so there's an interesting question as to whether a different administration in the United States will try to get that agreement back on track, and if so, whether Iran will be willing. Another current issue in arms control actually involves a treaty that is 35 years old. And this is the so-called INF Treaty between the U.S. and the Soviet Union that eliminated short and medium-range missiles in Europe. And it's been obeyed then by the U.S. and Russia ever since. It's up for renewal in February, I think, of 2021. And the question is, will it be renewed? The U.S. says we're not going to renew it because Russia's been violating it anyhow. So why would we renew an agreement and limit ourselves when Russia's been violating it? And the evidence that Russia's been violating it is pretty solid. But the bigger issue now for the United States is it doesn't seem to make a ton of sense to the United States to eliminate this entire class of weapons when, in a lot of respects, it's not even Russia that the U.S. is worried about anymore. It's China. So the United States has insisted that China be included in this agreement, that a bilateral agreement can become a trilateral one. China has basically said, no, you guys can keep this between the two of you. Because, of course, they would love for us to be limited and for Russia to be limited while they continue building. So one of the really gigantic questions for the next 10, 20 years of nuclear arms control, besides the Iran issue and North Korea issue, is whether the U.S. and Russia and China can do some of the kind of deals that the U.S. and Russia or the Soviet Union were able to do in the past. And trilateral negotiations are much, much trickier than bilateral ones, and so that's an important question. But nonetheless, the big conclusion is that in important respects, states have found it in their interest to try to limit the dynamics of arms races that sometimes don't seem to limit themselves.